The sailors rose early this morning for what was supposed to be a charged day of racing. 2 import matches and a departure for the third leg restart from Dieppe to Deauville tonight at 7:30. But when the sailors arrived to their boats, the lack of wind was apparent. On the dock, the atmosphere was rather light as well. Boat captains tinkered with their rigs as sailors relaxed with the morning paper. When the fleet reached the course, race committee announced a postponement due to lack of wind. The sailors kept their sails furled and took advantage of the calm, oily sea, enjoying a stretch, discussing tactics, and sighting a pod of dolphins. The wind never peaked above 5 knots, so race committee canceled both import races and sent the fleet back home. This afternoon, the crews took the opportunity to rest, except for the sailors aboard Courier Dunkirk, who couldn't resist the shoreside activities in Dieppe's village. Delay day will help fuel sailors for a slow night along the coast of Normandy. The race starts at 9 tonight. This 79 nautical mile leg is scored by a coefficient of 3. The fleet arrives in Deauville tomorrow, Sunday morning. The sad reality of sailboat racing is that some days the wind never shows up. Maybe there wasn't any wind, but at least some dolphins showed up to play with the M34s. At least they had that going for them. After sunset, race committee postponed the start to 5 a.m. the next morning off the coast of Le Havre. The fleet fired up their engines and motored for 8 hours along the coast of Normandy. They started at 6:20 this morning in light conditions. As soon as they crossed the start, spinnakers were hoisted and crews donned their game faces. Light air racing requires expert balance, precise boat handling, and extreme focus. It was a short race, only 20 nautical miles. Groupama led for most of the leg, with Courier Dunkirk and Breton Crédit Mutuel close behind, sick and tired of Franck Cammas' string of horizon jobs. The 2 yachts overtook Groupama in the final stretch. Breton Crédit Mutuel Elite captured a first-place finish, Courier Dunkirk took second. Groupama swallowed third. But the best story of the leg belongs to the boys on amateur entry Normandy. With an average age of 21, they arrived 4th to their home region, right behind Groupama. Groupama 34 still lead the overall event, but finally, things are starting to heat up as the fleet continues south. In Deauville, the Tour de France Le Voile met the silver screen today. In front of the famous boards, a French Hollywood walk of sorts, colorful umbrellas, and hot beach sand, the fleet raced offshore, the main attraction all day long. It was a living movie set of sorts. It was a beautiful day for the fleet to race just off the beach in Deauville. 10 to 15 knots of fresh breeze and not a cloud in the sky. The points went to Sedebo, who won the only scored import race of the morning. Voile and Cammas raced right alongside each other, but Sedebo, a rather irregular actor so far along the tour, proved their star power. Groupama finished second, Breton Crédit Mutuel Elite finished third. Oman Sail are in fourth, and the youngsters on TPM finished in fifth. Courier Dunkirk finished in sixth. This is the 6th year the Tour de France Le Voile has visited Deauville. Tomorrow the fleet sails the longest leg in the history of the race, 245 nautical miles to Brest on the westernmost region of France. Goodbye Normandy, hello Brittany. The 12 teams of the 2013 Tour de France Le Voile left Deauville late Tuesday morning on a coefficient 5 offshore leg. The fleet sails 250 nautical miles to Brest, the longest leg in the history of the Tour de France Le Voile, along some of France's most stunning coastline. The start of the race took place in heavy conditions with a good swell. A stiff downwind breeze prevailed and the fleet made good use of their spinnakers. On the sail to Brest, the fleet will have plenty of navigational hazards to safely manage. Especially around the Cotentin Peninsula. There are the extreme currents at the Ras Blanchard and the Channel Islands along the coast of Brittany. At the top of the rankings, Groupama and Sedebo have proved their worth, but Courier Dunkirk, Oman Sail, and Breton Crédit Mutuel Elite have promised to put up a good fight. It's a long sail to Brest and anything can happen. The fleet arrives in Brest Wednesday afternoon. A At 245 nautical miles, the fourth offshore leg from Deauville to Brest was the longest in Tour de France à la Voile history. The fleet fought intensely, racing downwind under spinnakers in 10 to 15 knots of breeze. The race was a picture-perfect tour of the northern coast of Brittany. The M34 sailed past Barfleur and the Cap de la Hague. They battled extreme currents at Ras Blanchard and navigated through the Channel Islands, the Flore Channel, and into the Bay of Brest. Thomas Coville's Sodebo was one of the boats that opted for an offshore route after dark, and they were rewarded with enough breeze to push them to the front of the fleet. Breton Crédit Mutuel Elite and Courrier Dunkirk followed Coville's tactic, and as the sun rose, the three boats were clear ahead of Franck Cammas and the rest of the fleet. Both Tours de France crossed paths on this leg. The cyclists on the Tour de France finished in Saint-Malo before starting the next morning at Mont Saint-Michel as the fleet surfed west just off the northern coast of Brittany. There are 6 stops to Marseille and plenty of points to be won and lost. So place your bets in Brest. The dice are finally back on the table. At 245 nautical miles, the fourth offshore leg from Deauville to Brest was the longest in Tour de France à la Voile history. The fleet fought intensely, racing downwind under spinnakers in 10 to 15 knots of breeze. The race was a picture-perfect tour of the northern coast of Brittany. The M34 sailed past Barfleur and the Cap de la Hague. They battled extreme currents at Ras Blanchard and navigated through the Channel Islands, the Flore Channel, and into the Bay of Brest. Thomas Coville's Sodebo was one of the boats that opted for an offshore route after dark, and they were rewarded with enough breeze to push them to the front of the fleet. Breton Crédit Mutuel Elite and Courrier Dunkirk followed Coville's tactic, and as the sun rose, the three boats were clear ahead of Franck Cammas and the rest of the fleet. Both Tours de France crossed paths on this leg. The cyclists on the Tour de France finished in Saint-Malo before starting the next morning at Mont Saint-Michel as the fleet surfed west just off the northern coast of Brittany. There are 6 stops to Marseille and plenty of points to be won and lost. So place your bets in Brest. The dice are finally back on the table. Yesterday, the city of Brest welcomed the sailors of the 2013 Tour de France à la Voile. For 3 days, the fleet was berthed in the new port at the foot of the old castle. Today, 15 knots of breeze and a cloudless sky, perfect conditions for import racing. Sail Oman fights viciously after a disappointing 8th place finish in the Deauville to Brest offshore leg. They take the bullet in race 1, followed by Groupama, TPM, Sodebo, and Breton Crédit Mutuel. Hats off to TPM, the young team from southern France that marked their best performance since the start of the tour. Midway through race 2, it appeared that the day would belong to the Omanis, who dominated up and down the racecourse. But the team missed a mark, and with that single mistake, their lead was up. Courrier Dunkirk took first, followed by Groupama, Breton Crédit Mutuel, and then Sodebo. Oman Sail finished 5th. The fleet heads out for one more import race tomorrow morning before departing for the next offshore leg from Brest to Lorient. During Friday's import race in Brest, Groupama 34 skipper knew well that his team came close to losing to the youngsters on TPM coach, who led for the majority of the race. But Cammas took an option to the right side of the racecourse and eventually pushed ahead. Courrier Dunkirk took 3rd. All 12 teams were busy sailing in 10 to 15 knots from the northeast and a weak current. Second overall, Breton Crédit Mutuel Elite learned the hard way. They finished 7th after being in front of the pack for most of the race. Regardless of the results, the fleet now needs to focus on tonight's leg to Lorient. This 113 nautical mile long offshore leg begins at 8 p.m. with a departure from the dock at 7. It'll be scored by a factor of 3. The M34s will sail downwind from Brest in less than 15 knots from the northeast. They'll sail around the west coast of the Seine Islands before reaching tack to the Glenanne Islands. Lorient's finish line will be moored in front of the Lamar plaque, and after. ETA is tomorrow around 12 noon. The view from above was something to behold. 12 M34s lined up on the start, trimmed to attack a 113 nautical mile dash to Lorient. They raced out of the harbor in Brest under spinnakers, and the sight was enough to send chills down your back. In the game of jives, Sodebeau was the first to score the lead as the fleet sailed through a bottleneck, threading the needle between Tudapoix and Toulonguet. There are fewer sights more stunning than the coast of Brittany at sunset. Nightfall brought no rest for the driven crews. The fleet rounded the island of Seine to the west and sailed through the Glénot Islands, Courrier Dunkirk now leading just a few lengths ahead of Sodebeau. At 8 a.m., Breton Crédit Mutuel was 1 mile behind Courrier Dunkirk. They had nothing to lose, and they weren't going to advance by following the fleet. Nico Trussel and his men were in 8th place when they quietly tacked away from the fleet and headed south, offshore in search of more wind as the leaders continued along the coast. And the gamble paid off. At 11 a.m., Breton Crédit Mutuel crossed the lead boat by 50 meters, capturing an epic first-place finish in Lorient. Sodebeau and Groupama could not believe their eyes. It was a hot summer day in Lorient, and the sailors of the Tour de France à la Voile were eager to set off on a scenic 25-mile race around the Isle of Croix. Legendary Vendée Globe sailor and former Tour de France winner Jean-Pierre Dick was on board Martinique BE Brussels. The scene was brimming with promise as the fleet left the dock this morning, but unfortunately the wind stayed at home, not enough to race, and the M34s drifted beneath a beating sun. Colorful spinnakers and small cruisers ghosted about the harbor, catching glimpses of the massive Mod 70 trimaran Oman Air, which darted around the bay, creating its own apparent breeze. The M34 race was delayed and eventually cancelled, simply not enough wind to navigate 25 miles against the current. Tomorrow morning at 4 a.m., the sailors leave the pontoons for Saint-Gilles, the final offshore leg of the Atlantic segment, before the fleet is trailered to the Mediterranean. After a painfully short sleep, the sailors rallied at 4:30 this morning for the offshore leg from Lorient to Saint-Gilles, Croix d'Avie. Tired eyes set about prepping the fleet of M34s in the pre-dawn darkness. Navigators downloaded their grid charts and took one final look at their routing options. The fleet left the dock like a line of ghost ships, visible only by the mast lights as they bid farewell to Lorient and headed out to the starting line. They began their 89-mile journey with a chaotic downwind start, the peaceful morning silence drowned out by the flapping of spinnakers and combative crews. The sailors don't need much to race. South of Quiberon, Sodebeau was in first place, followed by Groupama. Past the rocks of Taigurny, the fleet chose to leave the islands of Croix and Hudig to starboard, but Voile, the amateur Swiss team, opted for the other side, won against the rest of the fleet. But by the time the fleet rounded Normantais, it's obvious that Voile's gamble hasn't paid off. Now it's down to the final stretch. Who will win to Saint-Gilles? With the level of competition we've been seeing, it's anyone's game. All except for Team Groupama, the Atlantic segment of the Tour has boiled down to a tight race. Cammas was the first to cross the finish line in Saint-Gilles, just 1 minute before Nicolas Troussel's Breton Crédit Mutuel, who fought the green and white king like a madman right up to the end. In the 22 scored events the fleet has raced since the Tour began, Groupama has won more than half. They lead second place by 55 points. And so, today, Groupama won 3 straight import races, imperially stormtrooping the rest of the fleet up and down the racecourse. Let's just say that the real tour begins at second place, where the next 3 programs are playing a rowdy game of musical chairs. Breton Crédit Mutuel, Courrier Dunkirk, and Sodebeau. Today the Swiss skipper, Elodie Matreau of Ville de Genève, sailed valiantly, more than once threatening Groupama's throne. Our hats go off to one of the few female skippers sailing in this tour. At the back of the podium, the Omanis and TPM coach got after one another. In Tour de France sailing, not one day is alike. That is, unless you sail for Groupama.